Welcome everybody to this webinar, which we are holding to share some of the results of a research project entitled Building Community Resilience to Bushfires, a case study of Kangaroo Valley. This case study was centered around the community preparations for and responses to the Kangaroo Bushfire, which impacted Kangaroo Valley on the 4th of January 2020. And was one of many Black Summer Bushfires that caused enormous damage across New South Wales and other Australian states. My name is Paul Cooper. I'm a professor at the Sustainable Buildings Research Centre at the University of Wollongong, and I'm a member of the research team. But I'm also a resident of Kangaroo Valley. So I'm going to join you as an audience member very shortly, watching and listening to the research team present some of their work. And I apologize if my video and audio are a little fragmented, as my internet is not the best here in the valley. But I would like to first start our proceedings with some important acknowledgements. Next slide, please. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which each of us is situated. The University of Wollongong and its staff are located on lands including those of the Dharawal, Wadi Wadi and the Maori people. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and future. As we share our own knowledge, teaching, learning and research practices, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. I would like to say a very sincere thank you to all the volunteers and members of the emergency services and other organisations that supported the Kangaroo Valley community before, during and after the Kangaroo fire. And a particular thank you goes to all the frontline responders to the fires, including the Kangaroo Valley volunteer rural fire brigade members, many of whom worked tirelessly over several months and previous years, fighting fires, not only in Kangaroo Valley, but elsewhere in Australia and even overseas. And thank you to all our Kangaroo Valley residents and other people who participated in our study. Next slide. We are deeply grateful for the generous financial support without which this study would not have been possible. And this was provided by Shark Island Institute and the University of Wollongong's Global Challenges Programme. And I should also say that the research team were planning to hold a face-to-face meeting with the community at the village hall in Kangaroo Valley, but unfortunately, COVID restrictions meant that was not to be. So we decided to go ahead with this online seminar, and particularly chose this time to assist the local brigade and other stakeholders to raise community awareness of the need to prepare for the next fire season. So we hope this webinar goes some way to meeting everyone's expectations. I would now like to introduce Dr. Christine Eriksson, who will act as our Master of Ceremonies. We are very fortunate to have Christine with us online today from Switzerland, as it happens, where she joined the Centre for Security Studies at ETH or ETH University in Zurich as a senior researcher in August 2020 last year. Prior to that, Christine worked for 13 years as a social scientist at the University of Wollongong. With a particular interest in social dimensions of bushfires, Christine's widely published and award-winning research is focused on case studies in multiple countries and continents, including Australia, North America, Europe, and Africa. She first started working in the Kangaroo Valley community as part of her PhD research in bushfire knowledge and everyday life back in the late 2000s. Over to you, Christine.
Thank you very much, Paul, and also a very warm welcome from me. I'm really delighted that you could join us today. We're excited to be sharing our research findings with you. And as the MC, I am very quickly going to run through the agenda for the webinar, which will be a brief introduction that Paul has just provided. I will just very briefly cover on some mental health and well-being issues. I'll go through the objectives and the scope of the study, and then we will have 3 presentations from Scott McKinnon, Alan Green and Matt Daly respectively, which will focus on community connections and how the Kangaroo Valley Community Plan 4 responded to and is recovering from the Caravan Fire. Alan will be looking at the preparing homes to be more bushfire resilient, and Matt will be looking at post-bushfire reconstruction, supply chains and planning. And that will then be followed by a Q&A session. Next slide, please. Now, we acknowledge that the community in Kangaroo Valley and many other places in Australia has been impacted by bushfires, not in just the Caravan Fire, but many other fires, and how this impacts both in the short and the long term. Having worked with bushfire survivors and bushfire practitioners for many years, I know this is not just something that comes and goes, it can stay with communities for a long time. And so we really encourage you to acknowledge that this is something that might crop up as you hear us present today. We will do our very best to present this webinar in a way that is sensitive to the well-being of the community members. But should you feel the need for support, please, we encourage you to contact Lifeline Australia, who's always there 24 hours a day to provide support. Next slide, please. And the format of our webinar has also been designed to respect audience member and to uphold privacy. So residents and others in the Valley have shared very generously of personal experiences and emotions, and they've shared that in the assumption of confidentiality, and we will endeavour to uphold that. And for that reason, you will only be able to see the presenters' videos and audio. You will not be able to see the actual audience members. But audience members can send in questions and comments throughout the presentation. You do that via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And so these questions will then be filtered and will be put to me as the MC, and I will present them to the presenters during the Q&A sessions towards the end. And also just to emphasize that we will not be mentioning individuals' names in order to uphold privacy. The objective of our study was very specifically looking at the community and about building bushfire resilience within the community. So we acknowledge there's many other parts to a bushfire study that we didn't specifically look at in our study. So we aim to document the Kangaroo Valley community's activities and perspectives regarding enhancing their own resilience, and also to develop guidelines and resources to help Kangaroo Valley and other communities to prepare for and recover from possible future bushfires or other emergencies. And so this webinar is our very first sharing of our results. And we will be releasing further documents with our results soon. So there's a series of 9 fire research briefs that will soon be made available, and there will also be a comprehensive final report. And all of that will go on to both the Global Challenges website at the University of Wollongong, but will also be shared proactively with the community. And very quickly also just to show you the kind of 3 broad layers that we looked at in our study. So we looked at the households and everything from bushfire survival plans and retrofits or property preparations that were made to the actual response when the fire came into the valley, as well as the community, so looking at neighbourhood groups and how they stepped up, how the village and the local brigades and local businesses all played a really important part. And then also looking at government and industry, looking at reconstruction supply chain and the challenges that inevitably came up after these big fires. And all of those will be covered in more details during the presentations by Scott, Alan, and Matt. There's a lot of details on this slide. I won't go into all of it. It's more to acknowledge that the timeline that we're working within started before the actual Kangaroo fire. So our starting point in many ways was the public meeting that was held back in September of 2018, which was initiated by the local Kangaroo Valley Rural Fire Brigade. What we would really like to point out in this, and which you will hear in the presentations as well, is that we are working within the diagram that's in your lower left corner here, which shows the phases from mitigation to preparation to response to recovery, and then how that cycle continues. And really where our research project came in was in the preparation phase. And then we have been focusing on preparation, response, and recovery. And that, of course, then we acknowledge is an ongoing process, and this cycle will continue as well. And with that, while we just change over to the next set of slides, I would like to present my colleague, Dr. Scott McKinnon. Scott is a Pearl Research Fellow in the Australian Centre for Culture, Environment, Society and Space at the University of Wollongong. He's a human geographer and a historian whose research has investigated the social impacts of disasters in Australia. And he's also one of the co-editors of a fabulous book that was published last year titled Disasters in Australia and New Zealand, Historical Approaches to Understanding Catastrophes. So over to you, Scott.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you everyone for tuning in this evening. First, I'll just start off with by giving some numbers around the work that we did. So Christine has mentioned that we had these three levels that we were investigating. So within the households cohort, we did 36 interviews, and those interviews were between about 4 months after the disaster up until just about a month ago. And within that households cohort, Alan also did 19 site assessments on people's properties, and he'll talk about the data from that in his presentation a little later. And then within our community cohort, we talked to some business operators, all in the valley, service providers, emergency services volunteers, members of the Bushfire Committee and community workers and volunteers. So 11 interviews within that community cohort, and obviously a lot of overlap between those two cohorts. The community people, also residents of the valley in most cases. And then we had our reconstruction cohort that Matt worked on and that he'll talk about in his presentation a little later. I just want to quickly say a big thank you to everyone that I had the opportunity to speak with. It was just a great privilege to get to talk to so many of you, so many great conversations. I really appreciated the generosity of your time and sharing your experiences with us in those conversations. And I'm just sorry that I didn't get to meet more of you in person and spend some time in beautiful Kangaroo Valley. But in this quick presentation this evening, and this is just kind of a slice of our findings from the project, I wanted to explore a couple of questions around the idea of community, community connections, community networks that exist within Kangaroo Valley and how they played out through the Kangaroo fire. So looking at the question of how did community networks enhance resilience in Kangaroo Valley, and then what challenges impacted the effectiveness of community-led building of bushfire resilience. One of the reasons I became really interested in this question of community as it applies to Kangaroo Valley is because one of the first questions we asked in our interview was some variation of the question, why do you live in Kangaroo Valley? What's kept you in the area? What attracted you to the area? And pretty much everyone gave two responses, that it was the community and that it was the nature or the environment or the bush. And one person wrapped those up together in a pretty indicative way by saying, being able to live somewhere like Kangaroo Valley, we feel blessed, especially with the community. You come for the beauty of the place, but you stay for the community. So as disasters researchers, that's really interesting to us. It's wonderful to hear positive stories about community from people, but it also, we know from past research by other researchers that cohesive communities, strong community networks are a key indicator of a community that will prepare well for bushfire and that a community that will successfully cover through that challenging recovery process. So I wanted to delve further into how those community networks and those community connections that people were talking about so strongly in our interviews, how that played out through the Currawong fire. And as Christine mentioned, we're working through the disaster cycle. This cycle, so I'll talk about community connections within each of these 4 phases of the disaster cycle, which aren't distinct phases, they overlap, they merge together, but it's a useful framework for thinking about how a disaster happens. So thinking about how community connections played a role in the mitigation phase, or how people built bushfire resilience in the mitigation phase through developing community networks. And one thing to think about is how just getting to know your neighbours is kind of a useful step in bushfire mitigation, because those relationships that you build with neighbours and with other people in the community come into play in valuable ways in the disaster itself. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But then there were the more formal structures of building community resilience in this phase through community-led responses to bushfire risk. And in Kangaroo Valley, an interesting example of that is the work of the Kangaroo Valley Community Bushfire Committee, which, as Christine said, was established in 2018. So I don't have time in this presentation to go through the work of the committee in any detail, but just to acknowledge that this was a community-led response to bushfire risk that was drawing on local knowledge and that was reflecting the specific geography and the specific population of Kangaroo Valley. So thinking about some of the challenges that might happen or might occur around community-led responses to bushfire risk during this phase, we can think about the outlining of responsibilities between stakeholders in what's referred to as the shared responsibility model of emergency management. So this is the model that's applied in Australia, and what it basically says is that it's not only up to government to protect us during a disaster, it's not only up to emergency services organisations, but we all have a role to play: individuals, households, communities. And one of the criticisms that's often levied at that model as it's applied in Australia is, yes, it's useful to say that we can all share responsibility here, but who is responsible for which aspects specifically of emergency management? And without that outlining of responsibilities, sometimes that can lead to miscommunication, to disagreement, to conflict between the different stakeholders who are playing a role, including those who are playing this community-led response. So in developing that community-led response, it can be really useful to clearly outline those responsibilities from the beginning so everybody knows what they're working on and where they stand. And there's also, of course, the challenge with any volunteer-run organisation that's very time-consuming. How do you maintain the effectiveness of that organisation over time? And maintaining that effectiveness is a good way of building credibility as a community organisation with government, with emergency management, that you are still going to be there next fire season, so it's worth developing these relationships with you. But obviously for any community or any volunteer-run organisation, as key players step down or move away from the area, how do you develop succession plans to make sure that work can continue? Moving into the preparation phase, and as I'm sure everyone on this webinar is all too aware, there were several very stressful weeks for people in Kangaroo Valley as they knew that Currawong was burning further south of the valley and it was spreading towards Kangaroo Valley and the nearby areas. And what people told us, what many of the householders told us, is that during this time period, they were anxiously looking for information. They had that message, be prepared, but what did it mean to be prepared? What did that actually look like? What was the fire going to do? When was the fire going to hit? What was it going to look like? And so people are anxiously looking for information. And we tried to map using this graph some of the pathways for how that information was being shared, or how advice was being shared, or how equipment was being shared. So we have our emergency management organisations there marked in red. So the Rural Fire Brigade playing an important role here in sharing information. Some members of the Kangaroo Valley Community Bushfire Committee shared examples of bushfire survival plans to show people what a detailed survival plan might look like and that they could then adapt to suit their own purposes. The Kangaroo Valley Committee had also set up bushfire-ready neighbourhood groups, so using a multi-tiered way of organising the community in its bushfire response. And some of those groups had been set up back in 2018. Some were just set up in the weeks before the disaster. So that was clusters of 10 or so groups, neighbours who through WhatsApp or some other communication means understood themselves as a group, as a cluster within that response, and could share information and advice. And then local businesses and service providers often finding themselves playing a kind of ad hoc role as an information hub for the community, maybe for visitors to the valley. So there were still visitors coming into the valley in those weeks, giving them advice about what was happening, what was going on, what do they need to do. Anxious clients or customers asking for advice and to share information. And then, of course, getting to know your neighbours facilitates that sharing of information among neighbourhood groups as well. So some of the challenges that I think came up in that period, firstly, is that the search for information, that people were so anxiously searching for information in that hot and stressful and anxious time period, suggests the need for access to more information in the mitigation phase or earlier in the process, so that people aren't looking for information and setting up bushfire plans and making these decisions in that very anxious time, that it can be done beforehand so that you've got all that set up and ready to go in case a fire should happen. And then looking at those local service providers and businesses acting as operation hubs, I think there's something interesting to think there about how emergency management could work with, could identify shops or other businesses in a region that do end up playing this role, and thinking of them as conduits for information, or thinking about ways that you can support people who are taking on this responsibility for the community in what can be a very stressful moment. So these community-led preparation processes, thinking about how a lot of that work can happen earlier in the process and outside that very stressful and anxious time. Jumping into the response phase, and for members of the brigade, the response phase went for many weeks, many before January 4th, out in the field fighting fires further south. But I wanted to specifically talk about some of the householders who were in the valley. So the majority of our household, the people we talked to, the households we spoke with, left the valley. I think about 73% of the people we spoke with left the valley, and others stayed and defended their properties. And across those two groups, people talked to us about how these bushfire-ready neighbourhood groups, maybe using WhatsApp, were really valuable to them through this process, because it was an opportunity to share information, to get some advice about what was going on, or to find out what was going on besides fires near me and all of the other sources people are using. But it was also a form of emotional support, that people, they knew that they were taking part in this as a community, that they weren't going through this alone. So there's an interesting mix of ways in which this was both a valuable source of information, but also a sense of taking part in this or dealing with this as a community rather than an isolated bubble is really valuable. Going into the recovery phase, and I'm sure I don't need to tell people on this webinar that the recovery phase can be complex and a challenging process over sometimes a long period of time. But I just wanted to highlight one example of a community-led recovery response that so many of the people we spoke to talked about really cherished what happened with the drop-in centre that was set up in the main street of the valley within days after the disaster. So I'm sure many of you on this webinar are already familiar with the work that the drop-in centre did. One example of what someone said about the centre was that it was providing emotional support, financial support, legal support, community support, fundraising, everything. They just did the whole lot, and that was a massive time for them. And they did it with only volunteers, and it was amazing. And we heard a lot of very similar comments about the drop-in centre and how it was really valued in that immediate recovery phase, after the disaster. So thinking about that community-led recovery response and thinking about some of the challenges that might come up in terms of that recovery response. And a lot of the challenges revolved around the fact that it had to be set up so quickly. And a lot of people talked about how remarkable it was that it was set up so quickly. It was running within days after the fire. But what that meant was that maybe some of the volunteers weren't trained up in skills that might have been useful, IT skills, for example, that they could have contributed with, or maybe weren't trained up in providing trauma-informed care, or trained in looking after themselves in dealing with a community that's been through a potentially traumatic experience. There were questions around finding secure premises for a centre like this, and now, in the longer term, maintaining the skills and knowledge developed in 2020. So a lot of these challenges for this project, which people praised so highly, revolve around that fact that it needed to be set up so quickly. And now we can be thinking about the value of not only planning for a disaster, planning for the fire itself back in the mitigation or the preparation phase, but how do we also plan for recovery? And some communities in southern New South Wales who used similar models after the Black Summer fires are thinking about how to establish a recovery centre that can have people trained up and ready to go should a fire happen, so that it doesn't need to be set up so quickly directly after a disaster. And then I just want to quickly, because I am running out of time, acknowledge that that recovery phase and the mitigation phase are now overlapping. And that's been acknowledged by people in the Valley with community-led responses again. So the work of the committee, looking at assessing the preparation and response, making submissions to government inquiries, neighbourhood coordinators getting together and assessing their role, how it worked, what didn't work, what could be done differently in the future. So those community-led responses, starting that cycle again. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott, for those insightful reflections from the interviews with the community. And while Alan gets ready, I will present or introduce you to Alan. So Dr. Alan Green is a research fellow with the UOW Sustainable Building Research Centre, where he applies his background in mechanical engineering to research the physics of building sustainability, energy efficiency, and bushfire resilience. And that's particularly in the context of kind of fluid dynamics and thermodynamics and heat transfer, where he applies to a range of really practical problems, such as how to design effective bushfire sprinkler systems. And with that, I will hand over to you, Alan.
Thanks, Christine. So in this part of the presentation, I'll be describing the engineering component of our study in Kangaroo Valley, where we were looking at houses and other buildings on people's properties in terms of their vulnerability to bushfire, as well as the severity of the bushfire hazard that each building faced. And also through interviews with the residents, we were looking at the actions that they'd taken to prepare their properties for the bushfire, to retrofit the buildings on their properties to be more resistant to bushfire, and in planning to either stay and defend their properties or to leave early before it arrived. The image on this slide is taken from a 1985 publication, and it's outlining some of the features that buildings can have that make them more vulnerable to bushfire attack. And so we've known for quite a long time what can make buildings vulnerable to bushfires. And I suppose the value of our study in Kangaroo Valley has been to document the standard of buildings in Australia, to document what people are doing to increase their bushfire resilience, which hasn't been documented in much detail in the past. And ultimately also to highlight what can be done more and better in the future to better enable people to prepare more effectively for bushfires. This slide is giving a bit of a detailed summary of the kind of data that we were collecting as part of our study. So there's no need to understand all of it during this presentation. I'll be highlighting the key results in following slides, but just to give a flavour of the kinds of work that we were doing. Each of these columns represents data from one building that we assessed with on-site assessments where possible. The top block of data shows some general information that we're collecting about each building. Down below that is the BAL, or bushfire attack level. And that's a ranking of the severity of bushfire hazard that each building faces. And it's based on the proximity to vegetation, the type of vegetation, and the slope of the terrain. And its ranking categorizes buildings on a scale from low up to flame zone. So you can see by the number of dark brown squares, for example, in that row of data, the number of buildings that we assessed that were in that highest category of hazard, which is flame zone. In the next block of data, there's information on the vulnerability of different features of the buildings that we assessed. So here we were using the same ranking system from low up to flame zone. And here the lighter colors represent vulnerable buildings that are only sort of capable of withstanding a lower level of hazard. So for example, the lighter squares next to windows and glass doors indicate that for a lot of the buildings that we assessed, the windows and glass doors were a weak point. And then the lowest block of data in this slide is just showing the kind of information that we're collecting through our interviews with residents, where we were talking to them about the actions that they undertook to prepare for the bushfire. So this image is again showing us that bushfire attack level, or the BAL, which is a ranking of the hazard that each building was exposed to from low up to flame zone in the horizontal axis. And then in the vertical axis, we have the vulnerability of each building. So that's ranking them from relatively bushfire resistant up to more vulnerable buildings based on the features and materials that they had. So it's fairly clear in that figure that the vast majority of the buildings that we assessed had some vulnerabilities to bushfire. In some cases, it was only a matter of a few weak points where embers might enter to ignite them from within, or having unprotected windows, for example. But in other cases, we did assess some buildings that had a lot of different vulnerabilities. And some of the vulnerabilities that were most typical in the buildings that we looked at were unprotected windows, timber decks and veranda posts, combustible fascia and barge boards around the eaves of a building, combustible wall cladding materials, as well as gaps larger than 3 millimeters, which can allow airborne embers to enter during a bushfire and ignite buildings from inside. And this graph is showing a summary of the different actions that we documented people having taken leading up to the bushfire to prepare for it. And it's showing the proportion of the buildings that or the properties that we assessed on which those actions were undertaken. So from 0 up to 100% of the properties in our sample. So you can see in the top part of the figure, some general property preparation activities were really common and were undertaken by most homeowners who we spoke to. So they included things like clearing vegetation from around the property, moving outdoor furniture away from buildings, and watering gardens and lawns. And then moving down the graph, we saw in a lower number of houses, people were installing bushfire sprinkler systems and establishing bushfire shelters or places of refuge. And then on an even smaller number of properties, we saw people were protecting their windows by installing metallic screens in some cases, or reflective foil sarking for temporary protection in other cases. And in some cases, people were installing improvised bushfire shutters made of corrugated iron or fibro material. And we also saw that some people had been trying to make their buildings more ember-proof by filling gaps and cracks that might allow embers to enter with glass wall insulation and other sealants, and by installing metallic screens over vents and other openings. And so it's pretty obvious in this figure that the types of actions that we would classify as building retrofits, where the buildings themselves are being modified rather than just around the properties, were undertaken by a relatively small number of people who we spoke to. And there are a number of reasons for this. So one fairly consistent finding was that the properties or the households that undertook these types of home retrofits had people who had a technical background and had hands-on experience in working on their own houses and in building. And so they were able to apply those skills and those tools that they already had to the problem of bushfire preparation, whereas households that didn't have such a technical background faced a much more significant challenge when they were faced with the task of identifying what could be done and then doing the work itself. We also found that it took a lot of personal initiative for the people who did undertake these extensive home retrofits. They had to put in a lot of work to research what could be done and then to apply the generic advice that's available to their specific context. So there's definitely an opportunity there for advice on how to retrofit for bushfires to be more detailed, more customizable, and more easily available to a larger number of people. And we also found that the households that did undertake home retrofits did so over several years. They saw it more as a long-term plan where they made incremental improvements over the years. And so anything that can be done to motivate this kind of long-term planning and early action is definitely beneficial and would definitely help to stimulate more retrofitting of buildings for bushfires. And interestingly, we also found that tradespeople had only assisted the homeowners in undertaking these two of the actions, so installing bushfire sprinklers and installing shelters in some buildings. So all of the other home retrofits that we recorded were undertaken by the homeowners themselves. And this highlights what could be an opportunity for tradespeople to take a more active role in facilitating these kinds of bushfire preparations. That could make home retrofits, for example, more accessible to a larger proportion of the community, especially those who don't have the technical background to do it themselves. And then finally, this figure is summarising the original plans that people who we interviewed had in terms of whether they would leave early before bushfires, stay and defend their properties, or were leaving both options open in their planning, and how that mapped onto their actions during the Kangaroo fire. So the majority of households that we spoke to planned to leave early before bushfires and did so before the Kangaroo fire, days before the fire. There were a number of households who had a general plan to stay and defend their properties, but in the face of the extreme risk that they perceived in the lead up to the Kangaroo fire, they recognised the extremely dangerous conditions, and through the conversations that they had with experts who came to their properties to talk to them, as well as the community meetings that were held, they decided early to change their plan, and they left early rather than defending. And they also did so in the days before the fire arrived. But there were also households that chose to stay and defend and had planned to and did so successfully. And there were a handful of households in our cohort which left both options open, and invariably in the case of the Kangaroo fire, we found that they ended up deciding to evacuate late within the hours leading up to the fire's arrival. And we have fairly good evidence from previous bushfires that this approach to planning for bushfires can be very risky. And we can also compare our data from our sample to the data from Kangaroo Valley more broadly. So we can see that while we might have captured a greater proportion of people who are planning to stay and defend their properties than is seen in the valley more broadly, the general trends are there as well. So the majority of households are planning to leave early. A smaller number of households plan to stay and defend, and there are a handful of properties around the valley where people are leaving both options open in their planning. And so moving forward from our study, there are a few key takeaways that can be taken from the engineering part of our research. The first of which is that early planning and preparation are really key in dealing with bushfires. Even when there's no smoke on the horizon, it is important to be thinking forward so that you can put in the steps in place so that you feel comfortable with your level of risk when bushfires do arrive. And in doing that preparation, bushfire retrofits are an option, which are sometimes overlooked by households. So in addition to preparations of the property, we can also make modifications of the buildings themselves to make them more resistant to bushfire. And when we do that, permanent solutions are generally preferable to temporary solutions, especially given that some bushfires may arrive with a lot less forewarning than the Carawan fire did in Kangaroo Valley. It's important to plan for unexpected fires as well. And finally, as Scott outlined really well in his presentation, the sharing of information is really important in preparing for bushfires. So to enable a greater proportion of the community to prepare effectively, sharing information with your neighbours and through community groups can be very effective. Taking guidance from agencies is also very important, and there's opportunities there for that guidance, as I said earlier, to be more detailed and customisable to allow a greater proportion of people to retrofit. And there is also a potential possibility for tradespeople to play a more active role if they were to upskill so that they could prescribe and undertake effective bushfire retrofits. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much. And I'll hand back to Christine.
Thank you very much, Alan, for unpacking these incredibly insightful, both technical and tactical information that you've gathered during your interviews. So I was engrossed in what you were saying. But without further ado, while Matt gets ready, I will introduce Matt Daly. Dr. Matt Daly is an Associate Research Fellow at UOW's Sustainable Building Research Centre. And in his research, he explores sustainability and resilience in the built environment from both a systematic and a household level. And so he's kind of bringing that together in this study. And over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Christine. I'll just check that you can see the right screen. Fantastic.
Yes.
So good evening, everyone. Tonight, I'm going to give you an overview of the work our team did on understanding the reconstruction supply chain and looking at the role of industry and government in the rebuilding of homes and community infrastructure. And I'd also like to thank everyone who gave their time to participate in the research. It was really valuable and really interesting to hear the stories that were told. And likewise, say that it was unfortunate that we couldn't make it down to Kangaroo Valley more often. For one thing, my daughter would have liked some more fudge deliveries brought back to Wollongong. So through my presentation, I'm going to talk about the context as to what we focused on when considering the Kangaroo Valley reconstruction supply chain, why this was important to consider, and then discuss some of the findings of the research, considering the immediate cleanup and recovery, and then moving to the stages of the rebuilding process. So in any bushfire recovery effort, the construction industry plays an important role. And the construction supply chain is known to be a complex, often fragmented network of interrelated stakeholders and activities. And often they have little prior connection or knowledge of the circumstances of bushfire survivors. And we know from previous research on bushfires and other natural disasters that resourcing problems, including shortage of building materials, lack of builders, and cost escalation can be issues. So we want to understand, looking at Kangaroo Valley, sorry, something's going on there. From a Kangaroo Valley perspective, how the reconstruction supply chain and along with government were responding to the requirements of impacted communities in Kangaroo Valley and to a certain extent across the South Coast. What was the effect on communities and households, and how can this response be potentially improved? So our understanding of the key activities and stakeholders in the reconstruction supply chain was guided by the framework shown on this slide, the coloured bar section, which shows that there's a technical and policy context in which the construction industry operates. And within this context, a typical rebuilding project would involve a number of stages, from planning to sourcing of materials and on to the delivery or the building of the structure for the end user. And there's multiple stakeholders involved at each stage and we attempted to interview a number of them from each of this stage as we went through, talking to over 25 different stakeholders across industry and government in doing so. So we started by trying to get a better understanding of the existing construction supply chain around Kangaroo Valley, focusing on suppliers, builders and tradespeople within a 30k radius of the valley. And you already know this, but Kangaroo Valley is a small population. It's geographically separate from surrounding large towns. And what we could see is that there is actually plenty of construction industry suppliers and project-based firms in proximity to Kangaroo Valley, which provides a good level of access to these services compared to more regional and remote regions, particularly further down the south coast. However, because most are based outside of the valley, the travel can become a factor in time and price, especially when demand for work is high in other regions as well. So moving now, excuse me, there's a ghost in my computer. Moving now to look at the short-term recovery and cleanup. What we saw is that immediately following the fires, a priority for impacted households was restoring their water supply, arranging housing, and if relevant, securing feed for animals. And there was actually such a surge in demand for irrigation-related materials that it affected the supplies both at a local and regional level. And this became a bit of an issue as key items ran out locally and further up the supply chain, taking a number of weeks to restock. And there was also a strong demand at the same time for trades to help connect water and electricity equipment. At a government level, some of the key activities in the recovery stage was setting up a process to assess and provide an official determination of the extent of damage to all impacted properties. And this is key because for registering properties for assisted cleanup and also for accessing insurance and various assistances. And to streamline this, the local authorities established what was called a multi-agency building impact assessment process to make sure only one visit was required before a property was determined to be impacted at some level, which involved a lot of coordination of agencies. But the feedback in our discussions was that this was quite a successful, streamlined process, in contrast to stories from other regions where households could be waiting for a number of people to visit before they got their determination. And Scott mentioned this about the Kangaroo Valley Drop-In Centre, but both community and government agencies work to establish centralised assistance centres immediately in the immediate aftermath. So following the initial recovery, comes the reconstruction phase when people are ready to start thinking about when to start rebuilding, and this timing varies significantly. From our interviews, builders began getting their first inquiries by February and DAs were being submitted by April at the start, but then things are still happening now. So the first stage here is the planning, and this often relies on processing of insurances as well. Now, the experience with insurance in Kangaroo Valley and also across the South Coast varied in terms of level of insurance for homeowners, the speed and quality of the response, which is a common story post-disaster, and it was no different this time. Insurance levels range from fully covered for rebuilding costs, underinsured due to changes to building codes and bushfire attack level ratings since insurance started, and to those who didn't have any insurance at all. And this, I guess, highlights the value of having insurance that factors in the impact of updates to codes and bushfire building and bushfire codes to construction costs, as well as having well-documented records to streamline the process. Now, for households and communities impacted by bushfires, navigating the planning and approvals process is a critical step for rebuilding. And the local council undertook a suite of actions to aid householders, which included things like extending the timeframe for temporary accommodations to be on properties, as well as waiving planning and approval fees, and creating dedicated teams for working with impacted residents on their rebuild. And in particular, having this dedicated and skilled staff as key points of contact was seen as an important response initiative. One thing that was noted was that there was a tendency for offers of assistance to come shortly after the bushfires and be in the form of sort of short-term staffing help, when given the lag between a bushfire event and the planning, approval and building cycle, longer duration assistance and appropriately timed assistance can be more useful. So the next consideration was the supply of materials for rebuilding. And in the whole investigation, the reconstruction supply chain, it was very difficult to untangle bushfire rebuilds from the ongoing impacts of COVID-19. The building industry has been largely booming in the last year, with record demand for new housing, 20% higher than the previous record. So the industry is experiencing material shortages in a range of areas, mostly COVID-related rather than bushfire-related, but in particular, the timber supply chain was heavily impacted by Black Summer Bushfires. And just to on the COVID impact construction, demand has increased due to a variety of factors such as interest rates being very low, the home builder stimulus package, migration of people from cities to the regional areas, even temporarily or permanently. And for those who weren't, income wasn't affected, enforced savings. While at the same time, the international supply chain has been disrupted severely by trade restrictions, which has slowed up things moving through ports. And kind of following on from this, the price of shipping has increased, which means that less profitable materials are less likely to take up container space, and things such as even down to PowerPoints have been talked of as items that maybe don't make the cut in terms of international shipping when there's a limited supply of shipping containers. And at the same time, there's been construction booms in other parts of the world for similar reasons, which has diverted supply. What this does highlight is the importance of considering multiple overlapping disasters in resilience planning at a policy and industry level, particularly as the risk of extreme weather events continues to rise. And one factor that could be considered in addressing this is to look at local production capacities and the shortening and onshoring of critical supply chains, even temporarily, as a resilience response to disaster recovery. So as I said, the bushfires had a significant impact on timber plantations and mills, with a number of the mills temporarily closing or being burnt, and significant amounts of both native forests and commercial plantations being burnt by the fires across southern New South Wales or southern Australia. This has been a particular impact on commercial plantation timber, which has affected the supply of softwood framing timber for building, as well as hardwoods used for cladding and decking. And actually, supplies of the recently burnt timber comes through in the first year or so. So this is going to be something that continues to have an impact over a longer term, with expecting to be 3 to 4 years to recover. So as a result of both the bushfires and COVID as well, we've had reports of hoarding of materials, increases in material lead times, price increases as well, and an increased risk and uncertainty for builders and suppliers in quoting for jobs, because where previously they could lock in a price for the next year, now it might be only 3 months or even less that they can get a firm price from their suppliers. Finally, looking at the delivery side of things, the scale of the rebuild due to the bushfires in the Kangaroo Valley region didn't represent a significant change from business as usual, especially when compared to the change in demand due to COVID. So it's hard to kind of pick apart the impact from the bushfires, but estimates were that somewhere between 5 and 25% of workload was made up of bushfire rebuilds for the builders we talked to. And also because houses come along online at different times for the construction phase, it's kind of spaced out over the past 18 months. There has been huge demand for skilled trades across the South Coast, again, often COVID related rather than bushfire rebuild related. And in Kangaroo Valley, carpentry was one that was particularly highlighted. One issue arising further down the South Coast was that tradespeople coming from other regions to work on construction jobs were competing for rental and temporary accommodation, potentially with people displaced by the bushfires, which is an issue to consider in planning at a local government and policy level. For Kangaroo Valley, though, it's close enough to major cities for people to commute for day work, even from southern Sydney, which surprised me, but it is apparently reasonably common. So this was less of an issue, but there are definitely cost and time implications for construction. And just finally, kind of some final broader thoughts about what we found from the supply chain side of this investigation was that the construction industry, with its fragmented supply chain, is actually quite resilient, able to draw widely on resources, both material and labour, to adapt to constraints that it faces. But as we saw, there were issues with material supply, particularly with coincident events, and looking at shortening of supply chains as a resilient response is something to consider at a policy and industry level. And finally, insurance is a recurring issue that comes up in a lot of disaster research. And given the role they have both with policy and technical expertise, a discussion we've been having is whether the insurance industry could play a bigger role in encouraging household preparedness for future events. I'll leave it there for now, but thanks again for joining us.
Thank you very much, Matt. So we've now reached the stage where we're going to open up to the questions and answers. And so we have already a range of questions that have been written in, but please, if you have any questions, write them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And I will also just say to begin here, because one of the first questions is about the presentation recording, whether that will be made available for review later. And the answer is yes, it will. We had a number of residents who couldn't make it tonight and asked whether we could record it so they could view it. So we will be making it available to the community to view. Also because there's so much information that has been shared that I'm sure people would like to digest it in a bit more detail. And so the recording will be made available together with the via research briefs and the final report that we'll be publishing. So please keep an eye out for any communication or go to the UW website on the Global Challenges part. And it will be available there shortly, or in the near future at least. So moving on to the presentations, the questions relating to the presentations. One of the first questions is with regards to programs that are already available. So the question is, are there programs, for example, run by the Rural Fire Service or others that provide frameworks and standards for tradespeople to upskill, to provide assurance to those engaging their services, and for local community members to be trained in staffing a crisis resource centre? If so, what are they? And if not, what are some of the suggestions that you would make? Matt, I can see you're unmuted. Do you want to start by saying, do you know of anything that's available to tradespeople, or Alan?
it's not something that I've come across, but yeah, I'll leave it for the others to see if they've seen anything.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any programs available to tradespeople. There is the Bushfire Consultants Accreditation Scheme, which has recently been brought over from Western Australia to New South Wales, the BPAD accreditations, as they're called. But I think it is probably a space where more could be done to sort of upskill a greater proportion of the supply chain, not just the bushfire specific consultants, but also tradespeople. I think there is an opportunity there.
Great, thank you. And in terms of communities and kind of building community resources, Scott, is there anything that you have come across that you find particularly useful?
There's no programs that come specifically to mind at the moment, although I will say, and Alan spoke about this, knowing what to do is such a hurdle for people preparing. Again, that question of people have heard the message to be prepared, but what does that actually look like? And it can be so overwhelming that it prevents action on even this kind of smaller details. So I don't know of any programs for that, but supplying people with not only the information of what they need to do, but the actual instruction on how to do it, or here is a person who will do it for you, or here is a person who will show you how to do it, is an important step to overcome that hurdle of the action being so overwhelming that it doesn't happen.
Thank you. And I think one of the things that comes out from all three of your responses is that it's one thing creating the resources. For example, through AIDR, AIDR, the Australian Institute for Disaster Research, they have different disaster preparedness and recovery handbooks, and I do recommend having a look at those. One of the issues is that they're very detailed, and when you are faced with a disaster or the recovery of the disaster, that much detail is often too much. And so breaking it down into really tangible, practical information that can be shared and used by people that's I think the key that we're really looking for here, and able to build more resilience in terms of both the preparedness but also in the response and the recovery. I have next a question specifically for Alan. Does the research show a priority order for retrofitting? Where can you get the best bang for your buck?
It's an excellent question. Not so much from our study in Kangaroo Valley, but definitely from previous study by others around Australia. Well, I guess I should first say that it is very context specific. So it's difficult to give generic advice that will be exactly accurate for everyone. But as general rules of thumb, protecting the buildings against ember attack is probably a first priority, because we know that ember attack destroys most buildings that are destroyed by bushfires. So that involves closing up any openings in the outside envelope of the building, which could allow airborne embers to enter inside during a bushfire. So around doorways and windows and gaps in cladding and that kind of thing. And also looking for areas on the outside of the building where there's a small gap where an airborne ember, which might only be a few millimeters in diameter, could get lodged between materials. So trying to close up all of those gaps. And as a second priority, as a rule of thumb, windows can be very, very vulnerable. So protecting windows with metallic screens or bushfire shutters in more severe hazards can be important. And then as a third priority, probably building features that can catch fire on the outside of the building and then allow flames to spread onto the rest of the building. Retrofitting, for example, timber decks and timber veranda posts that can easily catch fire and then allow the rest of the building to catch fire from that initial fire.
thank you for that. So there's really lessons to be learned in terms of where you can focus more directly your energy when you know that you really need to. We have a question here asking for a little more detail in the context of where residents got information from on how to undertake retrofitting. So was there any particular sources that they found useful?
Yeah, and again, that's a good question. And in our research briefs, which we'll be releasing soon, we will include some references to the key documents that people did find useful. So they'll be made available there. Many residents we spoke to said that the books of Joan Webster were very helpful. She's put out a few guidebooks on how to prepare for bushfires. There's also been a few pamphlets and fact sheets that have been released by the bushfire agencies around Australia, and several of those are very helpful. The RFS website has some tool that you can use online to go through and assess your property, and some people said that was helpful as well. So there's a number of resources. I think one lesson from our study is that strengthening those resources is a real opportunity for the future, but we'll give references to the existing resources that were helpful in our briefs.
Thank you for that answer. I've got a question here for Scott. So did the interviews conducted reveal people's thoughts and feelings about the role of the neighbourhood groups going forward in terms of both preparedness for future possible disasters and in the everyday functioning of their community?
Yeah, so we did talk to some people about that, and particularly the more recent interviews. So we've got a sense of how the groups have kept operating over time. And it's interesting, there's some kind of differing views. So some people wanting these communication methods to just stick specifically to bushfires and bushfire information, and other people using this to communicate other information, sharing other information among the neighbourhood. And so a little bit of disagreement there about how the group continues over time and what it should continue to do. People had used it quite effectively to share information about hazard reduction burning that was happening, or if people are doing a burn on their property, that they can let people know, particularly in an area where the smell of smoke and seeing smoke on the horizon is going to trigger some pretty anxious feelings among people. So using it for that was a valuable method. But there are, I think, still conversations to be had within groups about how it continues to operate over time. Is it purely something that works for bushfires, or is it something that we use to share information and develop kind of cohesion or conversations within the neighbourhood more generally? And there are questions about, I think, again, that question of how do you keep these things operating over time? Is it only left to one coordinator to keep this happening? And is that too much responsibility on one person? Can we share it how amongst the community? So those kind of questions, I think, are ongoing. So I think it kind of, from the conversations we had, it established itself. People thought it was a really valuable model. But again, how does it keep going through years where we'll hopefully have no bushfires to deal with, but it can still be used to communicate information about the community? And just quickly to add, as new people come into the neighbourhood, as people move away and as new people come into the neighbourhood, this could be a valuable way of encouraging people who aren't familiar with the conditions of Kangaroo Valley or who weren't there for the Currawin fire to let them know. So to knock on doors and make introductions and get them signed up to these groups so that you can have those conversations and keep that advice flowing.
And that's a really good segment into the next question, because there was a question about how do you approach and make sure that new people in the valley are more clued into both the knowledge that's contained within the community, but also the experience the community has and the risks and the threats that are inherent to the environment. And maybe just adding on to the value of neighbourhood groups there, one thing that is a long standing conversation in Australia is what the role real estate agents could play in disseminating some of this information as well. So particularly for a local valley like Kangaroo Valley, there's an opportunity to share information there with people who are either buying property or renting property in the valley. So these are some of the ongoing suggestions that could be picked up moving forward. Just building on your response, Scott, there's the follow-on question to how to ensure that new residents are informed. Is there a consolidated list of resources or references apart from referring people to the RFS website? So is there broader information available to people on how to think about fire, how to prepare for fire, and how to make informed decisions?
It's a good question, and there's a lot of information out there in a lot of different places. So as Christine mentioned, the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience has put together some useful information. They also have a YouTube channel where they have their own webinars, which contain some really informative information. The ABC has recently put out a podcast about recovering from disaster that I encourage people to listen to. It's a really interesting resource. Yeah, so it's a difficult question to answer in some ways because there's a lot of information out there, and it's difficult to direct people to anything specific. But yeah, it's a significant challenge in a community as time moves on. That memory of the disaster fades as new people move into the area. And it's a really interesting question about how you keep that memory alive, particularly when it's a difficult memory. It's a challenging and distressing memory for a lot of people. So people quite understandably want to move on from that memory of that very difficult event. But using things like the local media, the local publications, Facebook groups, things like that, maybe on anniversary events or things like that to remind people or to introduce this topic to people who are new to the area is a really important step to keep those conversations going.
Thank you. And maybe just a quick follow-up there. I really do encourage you to listen to the new podcast that Scott just mentioned. It's called After the Disaster, and it's put together by Dr. Kate Brady from the Australian Red Cross. And it speaks to people who have experienced a range of disasters, everything from the Black Summer Bushfires to flooding in different parts of the country. And she also talks to experts, and that includes experts on kind of the psychosocial and the psychological resilience of people. And that's a place where the Australian Red Cross has lots of resources. I do encourage you to look at their bushfire recovery resources. They focus a lot on mental health and well-being, and they do have psychological first aid resources available on their website. So both go to the ABC Listen app if you have it, and listen to After the Disaster podcast, which is now being rolled out, and look at the resources through the Australian Red Cross. They are very valuable. Moving on, I have a question for Matt. So this is something we have also spoken about in the group, but in the Valley, telecommunications and internet access is a huge problem. Given the findings around proactive communications, was this progressed with service providers and government in the broader context of kind of supply chain and how to get the Valley back on its feet?
Yeah, it's a very important question, particularly for communities like the Valley. And it wasn't something that we got a lot of information about in our discussions. I think we did hear that I believe one of the internet or telecommunication services was one of the early things that were hit by the fires, which caused significant disruptions to a lot of people in the community, or at least a section of the community. So it kind of goes back to the general concepts of resilience planning around thinking about those kind of vulnerabilities and considering how you can create more redundancy in the system in the valley. So as I said, it wasn't something that came up strongly through our research in terms of knowing what discussions are being had about what could be done in the future, other than the efforts that the Shoalhaven Council is doing in terms of the sort of the centralised telecommunication hubs with standalone power and internet services as an information location in central communities around the Shoalhaven. But I think you're talking about different questions around providing telecommunications access to different parts of the valley. So yeah, I think there's no simple answer that came up from our research, and it's an ongoing thing to discuss.
Thank you, Matt. I might also just hand over to Scott here, because I know internet access and computer access was one of the things that the Recovery Centre was used for. Did it come up more broadly in the interviews with residents how they got around the issue of communication in the immediate aftermath and the weeks leading on from the fires?
It did come up, yeah. So particularly around telephone and internet. So a lot of people didn't have great internet access to begin with before the fires, of course, in a rural community, a problem that needs to be addressed more broadly. But in the immediate aftermath of the from the people I spoke to, you won't have, excuse me, you won't hear very many kind things said about Telstra in the valley. And it was a real problem, and it kind of escalates the challenge if you're getting in your car and driving away from your home until you find internet, phone, a couple of bars of phone reception on your mobile, so that you can ring the telephone provider to set up a time for them to come to your property, and you get put on hold for a long time, and you continually have to explain the story over and over again, and there's no specific communication point for bushfire survivors. It escalates the challenge of recovery more broadly. It has really difficult impacts on people's well-being post-fire. It just escalates the challenges of recovery. So the drop-in centre people talked about as invaluable for that. As for navigating it more broadly, people found ways of going to friends' houses to make phone calls, and that's very difficult if someone tells you they're going to call you back and they can't call you back because you don't have access at your property.
Thank you, Scott. I also have a practical question here for Alan about any findings on the effectiveness of rooftop sprinklers and the best type of sprinklers. So it's a very particular question.
And very particular to me as well, because my PhD research was actually looking at bushfire sprinklers. It's a great question, and it's one that we get a lot when we talk to people in bushfire prone areas. And the unfortunate answer is that the science behind bushfire sprinklers, the science that we would need to have in place to be able to say confidently what works and what doesn't work, isn't quite there yet. But we can say that the best evidence that we have is to, if you're going to install sprinklers, to target the water as directly as possible onto the target surfaces that you want the water to hit on, to try to minimize the amount of evaporation and wind drift, where the airborne droplets are blown away by the wind. And to think carefully about having an independent water supply, because mains water obviously can be unreliable during bushfire events, and a means to pump that water, whether it's gravity or a petrol or diesel driven pump. So thinking through how the system is going to work, how it's going to be activated, and then designing it so that the water is sprayed as directly as possible onto the surfaces that you want to get wet is the best way.
Thank you, Alan. This next question is kind of to all three of you. You've all three touched on it in various ways during your presentations, but the question is, Did the research indicate any difference in the level of preparedness in Kangaroo Valley for the current fire, as opposed to either previous fires or for the current fire in other communities, in particular for household bushfire plans?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think while our study focused mostly on Kangaroo Valley, so we don't have that direct comparison within our study, we definitely identified a lot of things that Kangaroo Valley did, which definitely benefited them in preparing for the Currowan fire. So a lot of the things that Scott was talking about around the community organisation, the information sharing about retrofitting and about what the disaster was likely to be like so that people were prepared for the disaster was definitely very beneficial. And to be able to compare Kangaroo Valley to other communities, we couldn't do that directly, but we could say that those measures that were put in place were steps in the right direction and definitely beneficial.
Do you want to add anything to that, Scott?
No, I don't. I think Alan's dealt with that quite well. We don't have the data to make kind of good comparisons. It is interesting to think about from some of the people I spoke to about past fires in the valley and knowledge of past fires. Some people had kind of good knowledge about that and the results of that, kind of longer term people in the valley, others not at all. So it's interesting to, again, to think about how the memory of fire continues in a community. But yeah, as Alan says, we don't have the data to make those direct comparisons to other communities.
Thank you. The next question might be challenging in a short amount of time, but I will just bring it up in case you have any reflections. What practical information came out of the New South Wales Bushfire Review that we could take on? Is there any kind of quick insights from that about the broad findings compared to what this study has found?
I don't think I have a really clear answer to that. We've read through a lot of the information from the reviews, and there's really an ocean of points of view and really important information in amongst all of the text that's been put together. I think some of the recommendations were definitely aligned with our findings in Kangaroo Valley around the importance of certain types of infrastructure, the importance of early preparation, and the need for more research and development of technologies like bushfire sprinklers were highlighted in the reviews. But I don't think I could give a very accurate overview of all of the information that was put forward because there is so much.
Matt and Scott, do you want to add any reflections on that?
Not from my end. I think Alan has, it's a fair point. So there's a lot of information there, and from the supply chain perspective, we're much more looking at how the recovery and response, and sort of looking at a different problem, I guess.
And I'll just add that it was interesting to come across through the research, talking to people in the valley, people making submissions to the inquiries that were ongoing. So people, again, this kind of community-led response that people actively telling their stories and contributing in valuable ways came up quite a few times and was a valuable contribution.
Thank you. It's kind of related. It's a technical question. So there's a comment saying, I have heard that in Victoria, building a compliant bushfire shelter can reduce bell rating. If so, would this be suitable for New South Wales regulations?
I haven't heard that that's the case. It may be, but I haven't heard that that's happening in Victoria. I know that Victorians do have guidelines on how to design a bushfire shelter, which isn't in place in some other states. And I wouldn't comment on whether it would be a good move to have it offset the BAL rating. I think bushfire shelters have to be considered very carefully and integrated very carefully into bushfire survival plans. They're certainly not a silver bullet, but that's not to say that they're not useful. And there were people in Kangaroo Valley during the Kangaroo fire who used them to seemingly great effect. So I think they need to be approached carefully, and I'm not sure how they should fit into regulations.
And another very quick follow-up question about something technical. Do you have any views on the effectiveness of BAL flame zone rated windows and doors versus bushfire shutters?
So they would be tested to the same standards. When you purchase bushfire shutters or bushfire rated doors or windows, they come with the BAL rating that they've been tested to. So from a scientific point of view, that's the only information that we would have on how resilient each element would be. So I would go by the BAL rating. And obviously cost can come into those decisions a lot as well. They can be quite expensive. So yeah.
Thank you. Now, I have the unfortunate task of saying that we're running out of time. I'd like to acknowledge that there are many more comments and information that have been shared with us in the Q&A tab. We have recorded that. Thank you very much. We won't be able to cover any more questions today. What I would like to do before we round up, though, is to once again emphasize there's more information coming from our side. We are very happy to hear from you as well, should you have any follow-up details that you would like to share. And I would like again to thank both the participants in our research. Without you, we could not have done this work. I would like to acknowledge the enormous impact these fires have had, not just on the Kangaroo Valley community, but the broader New South Wales and Australian community, and how this is an ongoing process and that we are all learning through it together. And of course, that's a long journey. So I really hope that our research can be part of that process of recovery for many of you. I would like to thank Scott, Alan and Matt for sharing findings today so eloquently and insightfully. It's very interesting. I would also like to thank Paul Cooper and Tilman Boehm, who are both part of this research project as well, who are also listening in. And I would also thank, last but not least, Robin Dawson, who has taken care of all the technical setup for this webinar to be able to take place. That has taken considerable effort, and we are very grateful for your work. Now, on that note, once again, thank you, and you will hear more from us in due time. So I wish you all a very pleasant evening.